Okay, guys, this is U.S. History, Chapter 20.1. Okay, your terms. John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States on a crisp and sparkling day in January 1961. Appearing without a coat in freezing weather, he issued a challenge to the American people. He said that the world was in its hour of maximum danger, as Cold War tensions ran high. Rather than shrinking from the danger, the United States should confront the iron tyranny of communism. Okay, you'll need to put a few more facts in there about John F. K, though, okay? Flexible response. So Kennedy believed his most urgent task was to redefine the nation's nuclear strategy. The Eisenhower administration had relied on the policy of massive retaliation to deter Soviet aggression and imperialism. However, threatening to use nuclear arms over a minor conflict was not a risk Kennedy wished to take. Instead, his team developed a policy of flexible response. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, McNamara, explained the policy. The Kennedy administration worried that the reliance on nuclear weapons gave us no way to respond to the large non-nuclear attacks without committing suicide. We decided to broaden the range of options by strengthening and modernizing the military's ability to fight a non-nuclear war. Fidel Castro. The first test of Kennedy's foreign policy came in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. About 2 weeks before Kennedy took office on January 3, 1961, President Eisenhower cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba because of a revolutionary leader named Fidel Castro. Castro openly declared himself a communist and welcomed aid from the Soviet Union. Castro gained power with the promise of democracy. From 1956 to 1959, he led a guerrilla movement to topple dictator Fulgencio Batista. He won control in 1959 and later told reporters, "Revolutionaries are not born, they are made by poverty, inequality, and dictatorship." He then promised to eliminate these conditions from Cuba. Berlin Wall. One goal that had guided Kennedy through the Cuban Missile Crisis was that of proving to Khrushchev his determination to contain communism. All the while, Kennedy was thinking of their recent confrontation over Berlin, which had led to the construction of the Berlin Wall, a concrete wall topped with barbed wire that severed the two cities in two. Okay, limited test ban treaty. Searching for ways to ease tensions, shot down between Kennedy and Khrushchev, made both leaders aware of the gravity of split-second decisions that separated Cold War peace from nuclear disaster. Kennedy, in particular, searched for ways to tone down his hardline stance. In 1963, he announced that the two nations had established a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. This dedicated phone enabled the leaders of the two countries to communicate at once should another crisis arise. Later that year, the United States and the Soviet Union also agreed to a limited test ban treaty that barred nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Okay, these are your study guide questions. What is the main purpose of flexible response? What three main things did the hotline establish? 3, this was a failed invasion of Cuba. 4, what ended the crisis in Cuba? 5, what two world leaders squared off over the Berlin crisis? So what was the main purpose of the flexible response? Okay, so the flexible response, let's see an easy way to say this. Instead of having the possibility of nuclear war, they decided to broaden the range of options by strengthening and modernizing the military's ability to fight a non-nuclear war. What three main things did the hotline establish? So in 1963, he announced that two nations had established a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin. Okay, so they established communication. This dedicated phone enabled the leaders of two countries to communicate, so they were able to communicate. if there was a crisis. Okay, so this would help them be able to avoid making quick decisions that could lead to a nuclear disaster. This was the failed invasion of Cuba. So the Bay of Pigs in March 1960, President Eisenhower gave the CIA permission to secretly train Cuban exiles for an invasion of Cuba. The CIA and the exiles hoped it would trigger a mass uprising that would overthrow Castro. Kennedy learned of the plan only 9 days after his election. Although he had doubts, he approved it. On the night of April 17, 1961, some 1,300 to 1,500 Cuban exiles, supported by the U.S. military, landed on the island's southern coast at Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. Nothing went as planned. An airstrike had failed to knock out the Cuban Air Force. So that's your failed invasion right there, the Bay of Pigs. What ended the crisis in Cuba? So the first break in the crisis occurred when the Soviet ships stopped suddenly to avoid a confrontation at sea. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We are eyeball to eyeball," and the other fellow just blinked. A few days later, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in return for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. The United States also secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. The leaders agreed and the crisis ended. Okay. What two world leaders squared off over Berlin? So we have John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev. Okay. Okay, let me go back to the questions here. Okay, so here's Mr. Lane's website. So you want to go to that if you have Mr. Lane, because he wants things done a little bit differently than Mr. Rempel, Leedy, and Tank. So also the way you submit things to your teachers, Mr. Lane, you're going to need to go to it. He has your submission, I believe, is more on this website, whereas these teachers each have a Google Classroom, and they're going to provide you a document. You complete the Google Doc, and then you submit, okay? If you have any questions, let me know, okay? So this is 20.2, 20.3. We're going to move on to 20.2, okay? The New Frontier. So these are your terms. These are your questions, okay? So the New Frontier. That's your first term. Kennedy set out to transform his broad vision of progress into what he called the New Frontier. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, Kennedy had announced upon accepting the nomination for president. He called on Americans to be pioneers and explore uncharted areas of science and space, unconquered pockets of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. Okay, so mandate. In his efforts to push his domestic reform measures through Congress, Kennedy showed little skill. Since he had been elected by the slimmest of margins, he lacked a popular mandate, a clear indication that voters approved of his plans. As a result, he often tried to play it safe politically. So they're going to ask you a question. If we go, let's go back here. Too far, I think. Okay. So, if you look at the last question here, because Kennedy was elected by a slim margin, what did he lack? Okay. So that's, let's see. So since he had been elected by the slimmest of margin, he lacked a popular mandate. That's what he lacked, okay? So that's a term in the last question. Peace Corps. What was the Peace Corps? One of the first campaign promises Kennedy fulfilled was the creation of the Peace Corps, a program of volunteer assistance to the developing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Alliance for Progress. A second foreign aid program, the Alliance for Progress, offered economic and technical assistance to Latin American countries. Okay. Warren Commission. The bizarre chain of events made some people wonder if Oswald was part of a conspiracy. In '63, the Warren Commission investigated and concluded that Oswald had shot the president while acting on his own. Later in '79, a reinvestigation concluded that Oswald was part of a conspiracy. Investigators also said that two persons may have fired at the president. Numerous other people have made investigations. Their explanations have ranged from a plot by anti-Castro Cubans to a communist-sponsored attack to a conspiracy by the CIA. So this has to do with the assassination of JFK. Okay, so let's get to the questions. This is a picture of the Kennedys at JFK's funeral. Who proposed the Peace Corps? Was it successful? So that was JFK. What were the results of the Warren Commission? Okay, so the Warren Commission said that Oswald acted alone. Okay. Because Kennedy was elected by a slim margin, what did he lack? He lacked it. We remember we did this one already. A mandate. Okay. All right. Let's move on. 20.3, the Great Society. Term number 1, Lyndon Baines Johnson succeeded to the presidency. So his ambition and his drive had become legendary. Explaining his frenetic energy, Johnson once remarked, "That's the way I've been my whole life, all my life. My daddy used to wake me up at dawn and shake my leg and say, 'Lyndon, every boy in town's got an hour's head start on you.'" Okay, so you can see over here, LBJ received, okay, so this is kind of a little bit about him. You can go through this. As president, Johnson pushed hard for the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. 65 signed the act at the one-room schoolhouse. Okay, so that just has to do with that. So basically, Lyndon Johnson takes over. He was vice president, and he takes over for JFK. Economic Opportunity Act. In August 1964, Congress enacted the Economic Opportunity Act, approving nearly $1 billion for youth programs, anti-poverty measures, small business loans, and job training. And then you can read on the EO legislation, what it created, okay? The Great Society. In May 1964, Johnson had summed up his vision for America in a phrase, the Great Society. In a speech at the University of Michigan, Johnson outlined a legislative program that would end poverty and racial injustice, but he told an enthusiastic crowd that was just the beginning. Johnson envisioned a legislative program that would create not only a higher standard of living and equal opportunity, but also promote a richer quality of life for all. Okay, Medicare. Medicare provided hospital insurance and low-cost medical insurance for almost every American aged 65 or older. Medicaid extended health insurance to welfare recipients. Immigration Act of 1965 opened the door for many non-European immigrants to settle in the United States by ending quotas based on nationality. The Warren Court banned prayer in public schools and declared state-required loyalty oaths unconstitutional. Reapportionment. The Warren Court addressed the issue of reapportionment, or the way in which states redraw election districts based on the changing number of people in them. Okay. There's 3 things the Economic Opportunity Act did. So in '64, Congress enacted the Economic Opportunity Act. It provided nearly $1 billion for youth programs, anti-poverty measures, and small business loans and job training. The OA legislation created Job Corps Youth Training Program, VISTA, Project Head Start, and the Community Action Program. What is the difference between Medicare and Medicaid? So Medicare is for Americans over 65 or older. Medicaid is for health insurance to welfare recipients. What did the Immigration Act of 1965 end? Okay, so the Immigration Act of 65 ended discrimination against Southern and Eastern Europeans and barred Asians completely. Okay, so that's what it ended there. Okay. Who embraced and praised the decisions of the Warren Court? Okay, so that one you get to do on your own, since I didn't do it. Let me go back and see the Warren Court. Yeah, I didn't do it. Okay, so that's it for chapter 20. If you have any questions, let me know, okay? You can email me, text me, call me, whatever you need to do, okay? So do your work, please. If you do your work, you're going to probably pass your class with no problem, okay? Bye.